All right. Can we get my slide? Oh, there we go. Perfect. All right, so I'm not here to talk about Kubernetes. I've spent a lot of time talking to audiences like this at Kubernetes. I always joke that I don't want to be like that 80s band that spends the tail end of their career going to corporate events and singing the same song. So I'm really excited to have a chance to speak about something else that I'm really passionate about, which is bringing security practices to open source. You know, open source has been a foundation of my career. In the early days of my work of operationalizing open source and building out Google Compute Engine, and then really harnessing and tapping into the power of community-centric open source with Kubernetes, bringing together the CNCF as a sort of staging area for innovation. It's been incredibly enlivening for me. Now, one of the things that we would be remiss not to kind of think about and talk about a little bit is what does the intersection of generative AI and open source look like? And in particular, what are the security implications? And so what I'd like to do for a few minutes is just kind of share some concepts with you and introduce some new ideas that maybe will shape the way that you're thinking about these technologies. And as a starting point, it's worth recognizing that, you know, generative AI is a thing. Like, I don't think I've seen a technology take off quite as quickly and generate as much impact as we have seen, particularly in the code gen space. And we often hear stats like, you know, GitHub publishes these stats. It says something like 43% of the code that's being generated right now is being generated by these generative AI systems. And the way I like to think about it is like, let's just look for the lowest common denominator. Like in the old days when I was growing up and when I actually wrote code in anger, which has been many, many years, you know, since I last did that, the way I would approach this is I'd go to Google and I'd search for something. I'd find an article in Stack Overflow, I'd cut and paste the code in, or I'd find something in Redis and, you know, kind of iterate that way. And, you know, my sort of operating flow was, you know, kind of grounded in this you know, sort of knowledge base and the ability to include that in my code. Now, as we fast forward to today, obviously, generative AI is now a natural part of that inner development loop. Not for everyone. You know, some people are still operating, you know, through the traditional principles and have still kind of inculcated a lot of that knowledge. But it is worth recognizing that this mechanism has changed. Now, curiously, when you kind of dig into it and you really think about it, it's not all that different, right? So there's a semantic engine. Google's a semantic engine. An LLM has a semantic engine. There's a knowledge base. Google has access to the internet, which is a knowledge base. These semantic engines are sort of running on multi-billion parameter data models that then sort of generate results. But there are some distinctions that are really important to consider. You know, the first and foremost is that by and large, that knowledge base in the sort of generative AI context is relatively static, right? So these models were trained at a certain point of time. It's kind of locked in time. Now, obviously, things like RAG technologies, there's a lot of work being done to make these models have access to a kind of more dynamic and more sort of evolved knowledge base. But it is worth considering that. And then the second thing that's worth considering is the behavior of these systems is probabilistic. Right? So in the old days, you'd be, you know, going to Stack Overflow and looking at a piece of data, and that data might be updated. What you're looking at with generative AI's, you know, models and generative AI-based code is a probabilistic view of, you know, what the most likely outcome, given the conditions that have been set up, will be. And as a result, it introduces some kind of relatively new and relatively sophisticated attack vectors, and it's definitely something that we have to internalize as a community. Now, when we look beyond the world of you know, simply the act of generating code, it's also worth recognizing that this has implications on our communities. A lot more code is being generated by a lot of folks who are not historically being, you know, sort of had access to these tools. I am long past my coding days, but I am actually able to be productive again. It's actually amazing to have access to these tools that give me access to coding capabilities that I would not otherwise have. And it's also interesting to note that the approach to development is changing. We're also starting to see agentic-based models, which introduce, you know, kind of new classes of code. We see access to technologies like, you know, taking Figma and generating fully scaffolded applications in the back end. So at the end of the day, a lot more code is being generated. A lot more code is being generated by developers who maybe don't have strong security practices wired into them, that haven't necessarily come up the hard way, that a lot of you have come up through your sort of engineering careers. But we're also seeing just new classes of application, new classes of creativity emerging, and we need to make allowances for this as we think about the security posture. Now, interestingly, one thing that hasn't changed, and I was using kind of cake analogies, and I promise this is my last baking slide. is the ingredients that go into these applications hasn't fundamentally changed. So when you think about what's actually shipping out there, like 90% of anything that's running a production system is simply repackaged open source. So think about it this way, 90% of the code that's being delivered into a production environment is written by random people on the internet. Just hold that in your head for a second. And those random people on the internet are increasingly using generative AI models that are producing these probabilistic outcomes. And AI itself is suggesting the repackaging of things that might be consumed. Now look, there's a lot of conversations going on about big code and the sort of the teardown of the dependency model and the ability for these generative models to produce specific or purpose-built soup to nuts capabilities. But I actually think there's a lot of value in the package ecosystem that we've grown up with. It creates sort of atomic and isolated entities. It gives us the ability to scrutinize it. And so I really hope that this doesn't change significantly as we go forwards. Now, here's the unfortunate truth. While generative AI is kind of introducing incredible capabilities for developers, it's also introducing incredible capabilities for nation-state actors, hostile actors. And it used to be that the security ecosystem, the way that the hackers operated was kind of as scavengers. They'd be scouring around, looking for an unpatched system, trying to find their way in and sort of get access to the data. These tools and these capabilities are turning them into ambush hunters. We see nation-state actors now able to produce high-quality, malicious content that looks exactly like the type of thing that you might want to use. And they're also not blind to the fact that there's a probabilistic model behind the scenes that's generating things like package recommendations, that's generating a lot of the code that you might use. And that represents lines of exploitation as well. We're starting to see evidence of people doing things like hallucination attacks. You go use a generative AI model, go use Llama 3 for a while, and occasionally it'll hallucinate a package name, write it down. Then go and look at the packages that have been recommended and what you're trying to do with it, and go and create a perfectly malicious piece of content that is derived from a good piece of open source software, but includes a subtle piece of malicious content. And that's the kind of behavior that we're starting to see. My little company has taken down, I think, about 47,000 malicious packages over the last 6 months alone. The volume that we're seeing tends to suggest that these hostile actors are also using agentic workflows. There's just so much content being produced. And this does represent a significant and existential threat to our communities as these tools become a part of the landscape. And so, fortunately, we're open source communities. And I always like to think about open sources as sort of finding strength in numbers. We have the opportunity to come together and produce high-quality security tools that will address some of these problems. We also have the opportunity to start really scrutinizing the content and creating a democratic apparatus whereby we can take a look at the packages and make sure that, for instance, there's a connection between the work product that a community produces and the artifact that a community produces with technologies like SigStore. We have opportunities to democratize data through things like the OSV database. So every engineer can have access to very high quality, immediate vulnerability information that can make informed decisions around what's showing up in the inner development loop, what's showing up in their production systems. And so this is a good time to come together as a community and really face these types of challenges head on and think about what needs to be done. And when you look at what exists in the open source ecosystem, there's this ocean of incredibly powerful content. There's a lot of organizations that have put their money where their mouth is and have taken what could have been high-value proprietary capabilities and made it accessible to communities through open source initiatives. You look at technologies like Trivy from Aqua, some really good tech there. You look at technologies like Bandit that emerged from the OpenStack initiative and is becoming a de facto standard for Python static analysis in this generative AI ecosystem. It's a really powerful capability. The problem is that all of these are being delivered as discrete tools. So the cost for a team to adopt these capabilities is linear with the number of capabilities they want to adopt. The cost to maintain those capabilities is linear with the number of capabilities you're trying to introduce. And that represents friction. When developers just want to produce great outcomes, when they want to use these great tools, like the generative AI tool, they don't necessarily want to layer on a whole bunch of hard to deal with integrations. And so what we really need as a community is a common control plane. There's just an incredibly important part of this ecosystem which is missing, which is how do we establish a framework that enables us to reason about the set of things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis as developers, start to associate those entities with the policies that we want to apply that could be related to these great open source tools, and how do we operationalize this in a way that we can use on a day-to-day basis, that it's largely invisible to us. So I take a lot of inspiration from technologies like Kubernetes. I felt like Kubernetes did a pretty good job of bringing a platform to the cloud-native ecosystem around which all kinds of great innovation happened. Once Kubernetes was there, we started to see innovation in the networking space. We started to see innovation in the observability space. And so having that common framework in place is just a great step forwards. And so I'm really excited to announce, as part of my sort of work in this ecosystem, that we're bringing this technology called Minder to the OpenSSF. Now, it's very early days. It's a very early technology. But it is really designed and is sort of intended to address a lot of these challenges that organizations have. As code volumes increase, as productivity increases, as threat actors become more capable and more effective as ambush hunters, it's going to become increasingly important that our communities have access to a tool that can integrate a broad cross-section of open source capabilities and unlock the productivity that these generative AI tools offer. So I'm going to call it at that point, and thank you. We'll be doing a breakout session. It'll be about in a few minutes, and we will have an opportunity to go through some of the details with you.